Discovered in 1769 by the Spanish land expedition of Portola, Alcatraz Island has played many roles in American history. The first lighthouse on the West Coast was located on the island. The United States Army established the first U.S. garrison on the West Coast there. Notoriety for Alcatraz came with the Federal Penitentiary. The island housed the nation's incarcerable from 1934 to 1963. This is a documentary about the lives of those people that lived on Alcatraz, the inmates, correctional officers, and civilians. There is no narration. The story is told by those that experienced life on the rock. For them, this is an opportunity to talk about their lives, to clear up the myths that have shrouded the island in mystery. For us, this is an opportunity to look at the past. And for Alcatraz, this is the final sentence.
You're out there hustling on the streets, you know if you're going to get caught, you're going to go in the bucket. See? So, it's up to you not to get caught. But if you get caught, don't try to be a good loser. I got no complaints. I knew what the law was. I violated the law. I knew what the law would be, what the consequences would be. So I got no beef. I got caught. I was stupid.
The public has been led to believe that Alcatraz was a pretty grim place. Actually, it wasn't.
Living on Alcatraz is I probably didn't appreciate it enough while I was there. I appreciated it more after I left, realizing the uniqueness of the situation.
The memory of my friends on the rock. I know they're all criminals. But it's like when you're in the Army, you have good friends, and then there comes a day you don't see them no more. And I had some good friends on this island.
Living on Alcatraz, we were a small town, definitely a small town.
Public has been deliberately misled, mostly by the media, but to some extent by the Bureau of Prisons. The public has been led to believe that Alcatraz was a pretty grim place.
Machine Gun Kelly, just sentenced to life imprisonment, will be among the first tenants. On that rocky isle, no underworld friends can aid him, and his boasts will go unheard. Alcatraz is ready.
My name is Philip Bergen. I was at Alcatraz as a correctional officer from 1939 to 1955. And during that period, I rose through the ranks from the entrance grade of correctional officer to the position of associate warden. I think that I could be considered an authority on Alcatraz because I've had 35 years of experience in prison work, 16 of them on Alcatraz. I lived on the island.
My name is Leon Whitey Thompson. I arrived here July 19, 1958. My number is AZ 1465, and I was transferred down here from McNeil Island, Federal Penitentiary. When I was a little kid, back in the 30s, I come from New Haven, Connecticut, see, that's where I was born and raised, and naturally I heard about Alcatraz, but to a little kid, you never visualize that one day you'll wind up on the rock. And I remember there's movies George Raft was starring in the movies, and the title of it was Alcatraz, and I went to see that movies, and George Raft instantly became my hero when I seen that movies. And I remember the day when we're coming out here on the boat, I'm all shackled up in irons and chains, and it was hard to believe that, you know, there it is, I'm going to become a resident of Alcatraz, and it was kind of scary, I got to admit it. I've been in prison already 10 years before I got here, so I wasn't no cherry when it comes to prison. But I heard so many stories, see, and it was just kind of eerie that I'm sailing up to this island.
The crime of robbing the mails with firearms, 25 years. We got the money, got all the money and everything else, and we got eventually got caught later on, not for that crime, but for another crime, and then they hooked that one on to us. I got no alibi for what I done. I had a good home, I had a good father, I had a good mother.
Well, receiving prisoners at Alcatraz was complicated by the fact that there was a mile of water between the island and the mainland at its closest point. So prisoners arriving at the island had to be brought there by some form of a vessel. Initially in 1934, the prisoners that were transferred from the east were brought directly to the island in the railroad cars in which they traveled cross country, ferried over to the island on a huge barge.
Took us in there, and they took the shackles and everything off, which was quite a relief just to get all that off of you. And they gave us what they called the ritual. You know, they give you the finger wave and all that, you know, and then after that, they give us a pair of scooters, them are slippers, we call them scooters, they're little slippers.
The normal routine was to have them enter the prison building through a basement entrance that opened into the clothing room bathroom area. And there they were unshackled and thoroughly examined from head to toe, and given the opportunity to take a bath. And after the bath, they were allowed to dress in the Alcatraz clothing and given an issue of all of the things that they needed, including the toilet articles, combs, cups, and so forth, that they would use in their cells. And then they were marched from the basement up to their cells in what was called the quarantine section on the aisle between B block and C block, which the inmates called Broadway. And there they spent their first 30 days.
Cell 204 in B block. And where my cell is, I could see out over the water. I could see the Berkeley coastline. In my cell, I had a lot of artwork. I used to do a lot of oil paintings. And this was my whole world, because whenever I was painting, like if I'm painting a scene of the Swiss Alps or something like that, well, I'm there. I'm going down there mountains on skis, and that was my escape from reality.
Well, the main myth about Alcatraz was that when a prisoner was sentenced there, it was a dumping ground, a place of no return, that all of the prisoners that were sent there for the rest of their lives, that they were lifers, as the expression goes, and that they were treated with merciless cruelty. The public's perception was that the prisoners at Alcatraz were confined in these medieval conditions, none of which is true, of course.
Talking from my point of view, and me, I thought Alcatraz was the best place of all, because there was no hustling. Everybody was the same. They all had the same kind of clothes. They all had the same. Everybody was equal.
There are any number of problems in connection with the operation of the prison, but oddly enough, the greatest problem from the day it opened until the day it closed was in attracting personnel. We had extremely great difficulty in finding people who were willing and able to work at Alcatraz. Of course, there were lots of other problems. The fact that the personnel had to live in San Francisco or somewhere in the area and had to travel to the island by boat. It lengthened their workday. Some of them didn't appreciate that.
Well, one day was the same as the next day. The routine was practically the same day in and day out. That's what rubbed on a lot of them fellas. They couldn't take it. Same thing day in, day out. See?
The first order of business was for the lieutenant to line the officers up in the administration area and conduct a thorough inspection. The other thing that they were very particular about was making certain that the officer was not under the influence of drugs or booze or anything of that sort. Never had any problem with narcotic drugs with the officers, but there were some problems with the abuse of alcohol.
Well, the first thing in the morning, ring the bell, you get up and make your bed and get dressed and wash your teeth and wash your face and everything. Then the bell will ring again and you stand up against the bar and take the count.
Just as soon as count clear, then they'd start opening up the tiers. They'd open up 15 cells at a time. They didn't open the whole place up, just 15 at a time. And we marched down to the chow hall, and we had to go through the electronic snitch box going into the chow hall. Food was good, very good. It was a good balanced meal, all of them. The only thing that becomes a monotony again is the routine. You can feed a man lobster and steak and the best food there is, but if you give it to him on a certain day, every day, you know exactly what the meal is. Pretty soon it becomes a drag, and the food don't seem to taste that good, but it is. It was excellent food.
Well, I would say that the morale at Alcatraz was much better than the morale at the institution from which I had come. The no-nonsense part of the thing, as it was interpreted, seemed to me to be the thing that made Alcatraz work. There was no silliness, no goofing around, no horseplay. It was an operation of strictly business all the time, at all hours of the day or night. And I've been called by some people a rules guy because I believe in the rules, I believe in following the rules, and I believe in enforcing the rules.
Day in, day out, day in, day out. And you can almost close your eyes and just go through the motions, day in, day out.
No, it was bad. The only thing that was bad about it, the inmates made it bad because they couldn't hustle. They couldn't get nothing. There was no gambling, no betting on the horses.
Alcatraz Island had a reputation of being a place of extreme danger because of the alleged hatred that existed or was supposed to exist between the officers and the inmates. And actually, this was my belief when I arrived at Alcatraz. It took me about 2 days to discover that nothing could be further from the truth.
Some were stricter than others. And if you obeyed the rules and followed the rules, you had nothing to worry about. Some officers, even if you behaved the rules and would might get out, but I never seen that. You mind your own business and tend to your own business and then your time, you never got bothered. When we first got there, it was silent. Later on, we began to talk. But when we first arrived, was no talking.
What was instituted by Warden Johnson initially at Alcatraz was behavior, good behavior, and decorum. And part of that was that there was to be no loud talking or shouting or whistling or the use of profane or obscene language and that sort of thing, which is so common in most prisons. So instead of a silent system, the better definition was that it was a quiet system.
Oh, I was in D block, and I was in A block, and I was in B block. I was in every place. I was even down in the dungeon. And I was hung up on the bars, too, giving an officer a bad time.
One of the things that I heard about before I came to Alcatraz was that the island was honeycombed with tunnels, and the rock was full of dungeons, some of them below sea level. And one of the first things I was interested in finding out about was these dungeons. And within a few days after I arrived at Alcatraz, they took me down into the basement under the cell house and showed me where the so-called dungeons of Alcatraz had been. The Department of Justice utilized these same cells for prisoners in punishment status who were what they call the noisemakers, the screamers, the howlers, people who, when they were placed in segregation, would see an opportunity to keep the whole cell house on edge. These 4 cells were used by the Department of Justice from 1934 until 1938, at which time the warden decided that it was time to get rid of them, and he tore them out. There was no wash basin, no drinking fountain, no toilet facility. And I have heard that prisoners were, on some occasions, handcuffed to the bars. I've also heard that this never happened. As far as I'm concerned, it was an unverified rumor, but it's a possibility. The major difference between Alcatraz and the other federal prisons of that day was the fact that the population was so small. The capacity, total capacity would have been about, say 330 to 340. And it was seldom allowed to go beyond 260 or 270. I think the greatest number that was there at any given time during the federal civil prison years was 301. Whereas in the other penitentiaries, there were usually several thousand prisoners. The second fact was that there were no dormitories, no squad rooms, no congregate housing in any shape or form at Alcatraz. Each inmate had his own individual cell.
The only reason to be a tough place, they couldn't hustle. They couldn't hustle stuff from the kitchen. They couldn't hustle,
These 2 things, I think, were basic. First, the ratio of officers to inmates was higher than it was at any of the other institutions. And the prisoners at Alcatraz could be given close personal attention. As for instance, in most of the other prisons, because there were so many prisoners, it was very difficult for the officers to remember the names of any prisoners except those with whom they came in immediate contact. In other words, you knew maybe 50 or 60 inmates by their name, and the rest of them were just numbers to you. At Alcatraz, you knew every prisoner by his name and never addressed him by number, always by name. which puts you on a psychologically closer at least basis than you would have been if you were a name and he was a number. And the second thing was that having the inmate in a separate cell by himself gave him a feeling of security and gave us a feeling of security in that we knew there was very little opportunity for misconduct when he was by himself in a single cell.
There were a number of guards on the island that I liked. I would never tell them, or I would never do anything to let them know. Kind of a secretive thing. Each prisoner probably had his own personal feelings that he didn't let out. You know, when you're doing time on the island, it's like playing poker. You had that one face, and nobody ever knew what's going on beyond it.
There was one thing that the Bureau of Prisons really hammered down on in the operation of all its institutions, and that was the danger of fraternizing.
We had some pretty good officers over there, pretty, you know. And the guy hit me on the head. He was no good. One of the officers over there ran away with his wife.
And we'd go sometimes 4, 5, 6 months and never say a word to a guard, never say nothing to a guard. And you don't have no idle conversations with them because if you're talking to a guard, another convict is maybe he's a little paranoid and he thinks maybe he's snitching you off on something or whatever. So we never rapped to him. At least I didn't.
Most prisons have a large number of stool pigeons or snitches. There were very few at Alcatraz, and the few that were there were all recognized, and inmates involved in anything they didn't want to come to the attention of the authorities made sure that the snitches didn't find out about it.
I've had, when I was in the clothing factory, there was a free man, he's an officer, Mr. Lang was his name. And the other one in there was Mr. Burns. And I'd be working on my machine, and he'd walk around the shop inspecting our work. And he'd come up to my machine, and he'd look my work over, and he'd probably nod his head at me, wouldn't say nothing, then he'd walk away. And right on the corner of the machine, I see a little wafer there, a little thin wafer of candy. And I look, you know, and I make sure, you know, because there's a gun rail outside, and make sure no guard is looking in or nobody's watching. I take it and I flip it into my mouth. And because we didn't have candy on Alcatraz. And I don't know how to describe to you how beautiful that little piece of candy felt. It's almost like getting your first piece. You know, I mean, it was, now this guy, now you might not think, well, that was nothing, but it was, because if this man was ever caught, he'd be fired. You know, in other words, he'd be a weak link between the cons and the prisons. But this was one of them things that you didn't talk about.
The admonition to all new officers was to avoid being friendly. Try to get along, but don't act like the inmate is your brother or your best buddy.
For some people, not all people, it was tough to do time because you couldn't roam around. If you wasn't working, you was in your cell. There's no brutality in there. That's all from the newspapers. It's sensational press. You mind your own business. You done your own time. You had no problem. You got out of line. You're going to, like any other place. You're going to get punished.
I'm Pat Bergen Rothschild, and I went to Alcatraz with my family in 1939, and I was 7 years old at the time. Stayed there until I got married and left the island in 1953. My father's Philip Bergen. He was captain of the guard there. I found that most of my close friends were on the island, and I had many friends in school, but it was a little hard sometimes to go and visit them after school, but it really was not a problem. Most of my close friends were right there on the island with me.
My name is Janet Moore Tarantino, and my father was transferred to Alcatraz in June of 1946. My family, my sister and I, my mother, lived there until they bought a house in San Francisco in 1950. As far as what other children thought of me because I lived on Alcatraz, that's one thing we just didn't really talk about. You didn't say, hey, I live on Alcatraz, you know. You were just a child, as were they. And when the conversation did come up about Alcatraz, one of the big questions was, how did you get back and forth to school?
Where I went to school in San Francisco, I was not the only girl from the island who was going to school there. The school boats were packed with kids going to school, so we really weren't all that unique. The only time I remember fooling around with the idea of being on the island was when somebody would, what I considered to be, ask a stupid question like, how do you get there? And I would tell them there was a secret tunnel that we took, you know, and we'd have them going for a while.
The launch, for instance, made 12 round trips to San Francisco every day, and each of these trips meant that civilian personnel or visitors or children or whatever had to come down to the dock and go aboard the launch. And that meant that the prisoners had to be kept apart from the civilians. And then we had the handling of vast amounts of freight, incoming materials for the prison industries, and incoming dirty laundry, that sort of thing, which had to be handled. The dock operation was a very, very difficult operation.
We were in proximity to a prison, but believe it or not, I didn't think of it that way. It was two separate existences on one island. We did see the convicts sometimes. We did not have any interaction with them, so to speak, although it was made clear to us that if we did come in contact with them even briefly, we would treat them courteously. We were not to be rude. And it just became a part of our life. It was not something that we made a fuss about.
Particularly in connection with escape attempts, there was a general air of apprehension on the island amongst the residents. In general, though, the separation of the residential area, about 5 acres of the 12, from the prison area, more or less separated the residents from the problem of the prison operation.
When I was growing up in the island, a lot of the recreation things that the children did my age, of course I was a young teenager, a lot of outdoor sports, baseball, and we roller skated and we rode bikes, and we had a handball court that we used to play handball, and there was a table tennis in there too. We played table tennis. And then if you were an old enough teenager, we had a recreation hall that we held annual Christmas dances, or formal Christmas dances, which were fun. And there were parties that the mothers and fathers had there, the guards, and then we'd not cater it, but be waitresses and went along with that. That was fun.
Alcatraz Island was very much like a small town. There were, at any given time, approximately 200 or 300 people living on the island outside the prison, and another 200 or 300 living in the prison. You might say that we were a small town with a large jail. It was my home for some 15 years, and like a good many other correctional officers, I lived on the island with my wife and my children.
Mother would be working around the house or doing normal mother things, you know, and we had a very close-knit family. I have nothing but fond memories of my growing up. My dad is very a quiet type of person, but he was always there for us. Just a great family.
If I were to close my eyes and think about my life as a child on Alcatraz, the first things that come to my mind would be Alcatraz itself, the island of Alcatraz, not the prison of Alcatraz. My mind's eye remembers Alcatraz as a beautiful island. Alcatraz is very dear to me. Alcatraz is my hometown as far as I can see it.
My honest opinion about it is that life on Alcatraz was a privilege.
We had a store, a small store, in Building 64, and as I remember it, it was sponsored by the club, the Officers Club, and it was there for our convenience, not for main shopping. And yes, we went there quite often for things: milk, bread, vegetables, meats.
Shortly after the declaration of war, the military moved the troops onto the island. They had anti-aircraft cannon and 50 caliber machine guns mounted on the roof of the cell house and also on the roof of a BC building. The troops were all young people, mostly from the Middle West. They, for the most part, were decent, well-behaved people. They fitted into the middle-class population of the island quite well. And as might be expected, there were some romances sprung up between island girls and the young soldiers.
The only thing that was wrong with dating was we had to be home on the last boat or we were in real big trouble. But other than that, it was very normal.
I would say all in all, it was a good influence on the families, and both my girls and my wife look upon those years on Alcatraz, as I do, as a privilege, wonderful years.
Sure, I want to get out, but once again, on Alcatraz, everybody's maximum security. You know, they don't have no classification for minimum or medium or whatnot. And I was on maximum security. But what happens when you're in prison is, for example, let's say you're doing 15 years, and for the first 8 or 10 years, all you're thinking about is escape. But then after a while, you got too much time invested. You know, you're getting to the other end now, and it's stupid to try to escape because you got too much time invested now. And I think if the opportunity arrived on Alcatraz here where I could have got away without actually hurting anybody, I would have went.
There are any number of reasons why there were no successful escapes from Alcatraz, but I think everything else, given its due credit, the greatest credit must be given to that water that flowed around the island. It was cold, it was inhospitable, and it was life-threatening.
Yeah, I was all set up for an escape. I had everything, everything a man would want but the weather. And by the time I got with the weather, I had too much time in. So why blow my time, see? I had a truck in it too, brand new one. I had the air compressor down in the shop and put the air in it. I had the grease. I had everything but the weather.
The escape attempt in 1946, which has been called variously siege or the Battle of Alcatraz and a number of other hyped up things, happened because an inmate thought he saw a surefire way of escaping. And the thing that made it look like it was possible was the fact that there'd been a slight deviation from procedure.
Scene of the bloody Battle of Alcatraz, the grim federal penal island surrounded by swirling currents of San Francisco Bay. Here, for nearly 40 hours of murderous mutiny, armed convicts shut it out with guards. the stern, forbidding rock where Uncle Sam imprisons the most hardened criminals in the country. A lighthouse looks down on the setting for a drama of violence and sudden death. In cells such as these, the drama ringleaders were Bernard Coy, Louisville bank robber. He climbed the gun gallery, squirmed through sprung bars to overcome and disarm a guard. Next, Joe Kretzer, desperate life-termer and criminal extraordinary. In cold blood, he shot down unarmed guards in an orgy of murder. Marv Hubbard, Tennessee kidnapper. With one rifle and one automatic, they waged a desperate but futile fight. On the Rock, pitched battle raged from the first alarm, when the electric lock system trapped the desperados inside. You can see the smoke from rifle fire and tear gas bombs, as guards fought to rescue prison officials held as hostages in cell block C. Their shots answered from inside. As the battle raged hour after hour, tense crowds lined the famous hills of San Francisco to watch the progress of the conflict in the bay. From roof and catwalks, guards hurled grenades into the prison fortress as Coast Guard boats patrolled the waters on the lookout for any convicts who might make a break during the melee. Cameramen and reporters kept an offshore vigil, while a detachment of Marines on the Rock stood by, guarding non-rioting convicts. Prison guards carried the siege through the second day, finishing off resistance with grenades that shook the foundations of the bleak island. Battered gray walls and shattered windows are grim evidence of the fury of the fight. Warden James A. Johnston, 72 years old, who directed his guards throughout the battle, and Federal Prison Director James V. Bennett inspect the damage. First step in the investigation now underway. To the guards, all credit. 2 of their number were killed, 15 wounded. Assistant Warden Miller, shot by Coy, scarred perhaps for life. For the criminal ringleaders, this gruesome end. Coy, Kretzer, and Hubbard, fingerprinted as they lie on slabs in the morgue. Theirs is the final reward for a life of crime.
Late in the afternoon of the day of the escape attempt, I was dispatched to attempt to recover control of the cell house, and our point of entry was through the exterior door of the west gun gallery. It's a matter of judgment as to whether the recovery of control was handled properly or not. In my judgment, it was not. But I could be wrong. My response to that sort of thing is to act as swiftly as possible to recover what you've lost. And my procedure would have been, A, to establish a defense perimeter around the prison building, and B, to set up an invasion group of competent officers to go in and do what was necessary to recover.
You're going to have to either cave a guard's head in, and it wasn't that simple, see. You may have to scheme and plan for maybe 1, 2, 3 years before it could occur. And there was no way of getting off this island without somebody getting hurt. One
of the most recent escape attempts at Alcatraz was one that took place in June of 1962. And the general impression that was conveyed in the movies and also in the media was that this escape was made possible because of the deteriorated condition of the prison, enabling the prisoners to escape by tunneling through the wall of their cell with spoons. This, of course, was absolutely untrue.
For
forbidding Alcatraz prison, from which no man has ever been known to escape, has its name for impregnability at stake. A daring break for freedom by 3 convicts triggers a manhunt through the caves with which the rock is riddled and throughout the entire San Francisco area. To satisfy the curiosity aroused in a story that would strain the credibility of any melodrama, reporters get the details from Warden Olin Blackwell and Assistant Director of Prisons Fred Wilkinson. The warden says eroding walls and steelwork allowed the 3 convicted bank robbers to make their way out with the aid of teaspoons and infinite patience. The convicts are Frank Lee Morris, who is reported to have masterminded the escape, and brothers Clarence and John William Anglin. The attempt was thoroughly and ingeniously worked out, even to planting lifelike dummies in their cots to fool guards making hourly bed checks. The same care was taken in disguising loosened ventilator covers with painted cardboard to hide the digging that month after month they were doing with sharpened teaspoons. After tunneling through a 4-inch concrete wall, they climbed up a pipe shaft to the cell block roof. Then, in a series of incredible climbs and drops, they reached the water's edge. Coast Guard, Army, and police scour the swift waters of San Francisco Bay, through which they would have had to swim or go by raft to shore or nearby Angel Island. Their fiction-like bid for freedom makes history of a grimly fascinating sort.
Now, what actually happened was we knew this break was coming down at least 3 or 4 months ahead of time because it took the cooperation of other convicts to help set things up.
It's been said that at Alcatraz, prisoners were counted more frequently than they were at any other prison in the world. And this may or may not be so, but they were counted frequently. We had 12 official counts every day and an equal number of unofficial counts between the official counts.
I could actually hear them going across the roof, and I can hear the seagulls because they would disturb them seagulls. And of course, they didn't discover the break until approximately 10 minutes to 7 the next morning. The guards was counting dummies all night long. And the next morning they discovered the dummies, and that's when all hell broke loose. See, what I always believed was that they were actually picked up out here in the bay, picked up by a guard in a boat. I think the payoff had been made, and I believe out here in this bay, this guard that's helped set this up could not take a chance of these convicts being caught to implicate him. And I believe that boom, 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 he knocked them off out in that bay. He was already all set up to do it, and deep sixed them.
And my considered opinion of that is that while it's possible, it's highly improbable. The forces, the police forces of the area, the military as well as the civilian law enforcement agencies had combed the Bay Area so thoroughly and found no indication whatsoever of anything that would indicate that the escapees survived.
I think the public back in them days wanted to think the worst of us. You see, this was what even Russia called us United States secret prison, because nobody ever knew what was going on in Alcatraz. You know, news reporters, nobody could get on this island. Even the President of the United States couldn't just drive up to this island. They got to have a 24-hour notice. Even the director of Bureau of Prisons, Bennett, had to give a 24-hour notice before he can get on this rock. And nobody ever knew what was going on this island. So what would happen, people would guess. They'd make up stories. You know, they had the red and white rubberneck boats come sailing around this island. And on days when the wind was just right, you could hear them up in the cell block giving their spill, you know. On this island, everybody's doing natural life. On this island, you got rapists, you got mad dog killers. This is the scum of the earth. And they kept telling the public this. And okay, so there were killers on this island. were on here for various crimes, but you could take the worst man on Alcatraz, but somewhere inside of him, he had a weak spot there.
Probably our most famous prisoner, largely because of his nickname, was George Barnes, who was imprisoned under the name of Kelly, nicknamed Machine Gun Kelly, who was in for kidnapping. In spite of his horrendous reputation of being a bloodthirsty killer, George Barnes was one of our better prisoners. Never gave us any trouble whatsoever, was neat and clean and polite and decent in all his responses. If you didn't know he was a criminal, he was the kind of guy you'd enjoy sitting down across the table from. Another notorious prisoner that we had was Robert Stroud. He nicknamed Mr. Bob by the other inmates. He was a very, very complex character, and been unofficially at least diagnosed as homicidal and suicidal. Stroud never had his birds on Alcatraz. The title Birdman of Alcatraz was something that had been thought up by the ghostwriter of the book Birdman of Alcatraz. He conferred that title on him. I got to know things about him and about his time and his experiences in and out of prison that convinced me, A, that prison was the right place for him, and B, that outside of that, he was a remarkable character that in many ways was a better person than I was.
Well, Al Capone was all right, yeah. He minded his own business. And Al Capone had the money, and he had the connections, outside. Most all the money in Alcatraz come from Al Capone. If Al Capone liked you, he'd take care of you. He'll take care of your people. He was a good man with a buck. He wasn't tight.
Capone brought his fame with him when he was transferred to Alcatraz from Atlanta. In Chicago, he was continually in the headlines of all the newspapers. You could hardly open your newspaper without seeing some reference to the Capone mob, which they call the outfit. No notoriety about Capone whatsoever, although the newspapers occasionally would release some so-called inside information about Capone's life on the rock, most of which was entirely false. The policy of the Bureau and of the institution was to treat the cell as if it were a room in your own home. The analogy that we used in instructing officers was act as though somebody had told you that your son was on booze or drugs, and you're checking his room thoroughly to make sure that it either is true or untrue.
They used to inspect themselves when we were down in the mills working. See, they didn't actually come in there and inspect them while we're in the cell. It's always when we're out. They'd come in there, and sometimes we'd come back, we'd find our cell all torn up. A lot of times, they shake your cell down. They use that as an excuse to break up your house. They throw your sheets on the floor and step all over them. And this didn't happen too often, but it had happened.
I've searched 1,000 cells in my time, and I've cooperated and worked with teams of officers in doing the same thing. And I would say that during my time, those 16 years on Alcatraz, that no cell was ever trashed. We didn't always succeed in remaking the bed as neatly as the inmate had left it, but we were obliged to at least try. The visiting privilege at Alcatraz was probably the most strictly observed, security-wise, of any procedure in the federal system. And this, coupled with the fact that most of the inmates at Alcatraz were a long way off from their home place, made visits very infrequent.
They had about 5 stations where you could talk, see? And well, you was on this side, and the other, your wife or your mother was on the other side.
They looked at each other through shatterproof glass and talked over a telephone which was monitored in the front office. Might say at this point that we did not listen religiously to the conversations, although the inmates were sure that we did. The uniform that the officers at Alcatraz wore changed over the years, but generally the emphasis was on wearing a uniform that didn't look like a uniform. Or more appropriately, I guess I'd say it didn't look like a policeman's uniform. They did away with such things as brass buttons and insignia and things of that sort, and dressed the officers in uniform clothing, usually a double-breasted gray suit coat and gray trousers, which tended to make them look more like a social worker than a cop. That was about the philosophy. Alcatraz had a better fire protection, I guess, than any community that I've ever lived in. Everybody that lived on the island was automatically a volunteer if he was of the male sex. And we had regular drills at least once a month, and it was a pretty efficient firefighting unit. Because of the fact that there was no fresh water on the island, it was very expensive to buy it. We didn't want to waste it. So as far as we could in our water mains for the fire department, we used salt water.
Mail, yes. Yeah, that was another bad thing they'd done. They used to censor the mail too much. You know, fouled it up. Tear the page out of that there.
As far as I know, from day one until the last day, the Alcatraz inmate mail was censored. It was very, very closely censored to begin with. That gradually relaxed over the years to where by the 50s, while it was all read, particular attention was only paid to maybe 1/4 of the population who were regarded as potential escape risks. And the censorship was extended to cover the magazines that they subscribed to, and we also censored the magazines that were purchased for the library, and there was no newspapers allowed. We censored the outgoing mail as well. The serving the meals was probably one of the most important functions, because the old saying goes that our army travels on its belly, and the prisons are no different. The average number of inmates in the dining room at a given time would be somewhere between 250 and 275 or maybe 300. The meals at Alcatraz, just like was customary at all the other federal institutions, were prepared entirely by inmate workers under the supervision of qualified civilian stewards. In the preparation of food, particularly in the butcher shop operation, it was necessary to use cutting tools, various knives and saws and things of that sort. These tools were kept in a locked cabinet and issued as needed, and very carefully watched by the correctional officer who was assigned to the kitchen, and returned to the cabinet as soon as the use had been completed. As far as the tableware that was used in the dining room, the knives, forks, and spoons, stainless steel, were kept in a locked box in the kitchen and they were issued on the basis of what was needed for the eating of a given meal. And the inmates could not leave the dining room, could not get up from the table until one of the officers approached the table, checked the silverware, and motioned them to get up and leave the dining room.
The day I was released from Alcatraz, October 25th, 1962, a guard took me to San Francisco, and I got on the Greyhound bus. I'm going over the Oakland Bay Bridge, and as we're going over, it was a real beautiful sunny day, and I could look out and I could see the island setting out here in the bay, and it was kind of a funny feeling. I can't describe the feeling, to look out and see it. And across from me was two elderly people, maybe in their 60s. I think there were a couple of tourists. And this woman said to her husband, I don't know what his name was, but John, we'll call him John. Oh, John, she says, look, there's Alcatraz Island. And he said, I'll never forget this as long as I live. He said, oh, yes, yes. He says, there were all mad dog killers out there. And I had a pretty bad temper even then. And I started to jump up to defend myself, because nobody ever could defend the men on Alcatraz, but I didn't say nothing. And then the woman turned, and she happened to see my face. I was looking over her shoulder at the rock. She happened to see my face, and she smiled at me. And something inside me told me, go ahead, smile at her. So I smiled, a fake smile. And then I thought to myself, I wonder what this woman would think if this man she just smiled at, if she realized that he just left that island no more than 45 minutes ago, that I was one of the mad dog killers of Alcatraz.
I got there by my own self. I robbed the mail, I got caught, I got to pay off. What the hell? I was a loser. I got no alibi.
I must have had 48 mothers. No matter what I did, if it was the least bit wrong, somebody knew about it. It was just, everybody was watching out for one another. And I have very, very good memories of Alcatraz, very good memories. Comfortable.
Living on Alcatraz, we were a small town, definitely a small town. People took care of other people, watched out, parents watched out for children, but living there as a child, as a 12-year-old, on up till I was 17, I didn't think of it like that. To me, it was just home. It was a place where I was safe.
I got some good memories from here. And I gotta admit, kind of start turning my thinking around a little bit. Made me appreciate that free world just a little bit more. It made me realize how much I want to stay out there. And also, I never think negative anymore. Continuously positive thinking. I know I'm an old man, but I gotta always come back here, because this is kind of my turning point right here in life, you know.
Alcatraz was not a dead end, it was a turnaround. That there was a definite effort made to straighten out people who needed straightening out. And I know beyond any shadow of a doubt that we were successful in straightening out a large number of people who, if it hadn't been for us meaning Alcatraz and its people, would probably have gone the other way, become worse instead of better.